Imagine, if you will, the end of everything. Whatever you knew, whatever you had, whatever you cared about, all of it is simply gone. There's just you, the sharp edges of cold stone, the chill morning dew, and an ill wind blowing overhead. The sight of blood oozing from the remains of houses lingers in your memory. The twisting of your ankles as you stagger across the shredded ground. How might you react? Do you weep? Do you mourn the fallen? Does your heart ache for what was lost? Or do you laugh? Did they have it coming? Do you scorn the dead and spit on their graves? Is their memory a sick joke that should have ended long ago? Elizabeth Hartley, for her part, wept. She lay curled upon the cold stone, having stumbled over a cliff and fallen in a daze. It didn't really matter to her where she was. It was enough that everyone and everything she loved was dead. All that was left was to curl up, pull her little red cloak tight about herself, shed her tears, and await the end. Elizabeth, however, was not quite alone. The insects had gone quiet. There was a faint sound of scraping, as of steel against stone, and heavy, ponderous footsteps. The monster of the gorge was on the hunt. Saliva dripped from his teeth, and his tongue lolled listlessly out the side of his mouth. Exhausted and oblivious in his own right, Monster dragged his signature halberd on the ground behind him, its formidable axe-head sharpening against the ground as if against a grindstone. All at once, his ears perked up, his nose twitched, and with a growl he took his halberd into both hands. Monster smelled an intruder. He zeroed in on the scent, not unlike a bloodhound, bounding across the rocky earth, splashing through the rancid stream. Monster was not fond of intruders. This was his land, for he had no other. Intruders were a threat. What might happen if the gorge was found habitable? Might more mice come? Then what might become of Monster? He would have to leave and search for another home. So, of course, the intruder had to be found and driven out. The only alternative was to kill them. Elizabeth was not hard to find. She lay where she had fallen, and made no attempt to hide. To be found, even by such a grotesque predator as a spider or centipede, to die such a gut-churning death as to be consumed by such a creature, would have been a mercy. It was only a matter of time before someone or something took notice. Already, flies were circling over her like tiny vultures, waiting for Elizabeth to die, or for something to kill her, before buzzing down to pick over her remains. Yet they never got the chance, for there arose a distinctive, terrifying scent, floating up from the lower reaches of the gorge. The flies scattered. Monster had come. Most often he preyed upon tarantulas, large spiders, and centipedes. But Monster was not above snatching flies from the air. He could leap like a grasshopper, and strike like a mantis. Upon laying eyes upon the ragged bundle on the ground, Monster loosed an ear-splitting shriek. Everywhere throughout the gorge, spiders retreated into their dens, and centipedes crawled under rocks and into the mouths of small caves, out of sight. But that curled, shuddering ball of hair and cloth didn't so much as flinch, for Elizabeth had sunken into a suicidal nihilism. Nothing mattered any more. Whatever did was gone. Monster loomed over the little mouse, letting his saliva drip on her shoulder. She offered no response. Monster raised his halberd over his head and let a thundering howl rip forth from his throat. Elizabeth was still. Monster sighed in disgust, and nudged Elizabeth with the blunt end of his halberd.
"What? Do you want me to cleave you in two?"
At last there came an answer of sorts. Elizabeth looked up, through a thick veil of tears. She could barely see him, just the faint outline of a towering form.
"You!"
Monster recoiled at the first glimpse of her. He silently scolded himself for his shock. Elizabeth was the only mouse that could stare him down, the only mouse that did not turn tail and flee at the mere thought of him. Of course it was her. It could be no one else.
So, you've returned.
Elizabeth nodded silently with a faint sniffle. She blinked, letting her tears fall to the ground.
You must be mad. Do you have some kind of death wish?
I do.
Monster twitched. First his nose, then fingers, and finally his tail.
But how? You're one of them. You have everything to live for.
Had.
Elizabeth choked out. Through her tears, Elizabeth could not see the confusion on Monster's face.
They rejected you?
His voice grew harsh with rage.
Of all people, they turned on you?
Elizabeth shook her head.
I'm not sure what happened. Late last night, I heard a terrible howling in the village. I ran to see what was happening, and they were there.
Elizabeth's voice faltered. She drew a handkerchief from a pocket in her cloak and blew her nose. Monster, overcome with curiosity, settled onto the ground and waited for her to continue.
I saw villagers fleeing for their lives. Women, children, elderly. The men tried to defend them, but those things... They were too large, and there were too many.
Elizabeth buried her face in her hands.
I couldn't do anything but watch. Then it saw me. A single eye. A giant, terrible green eye.
Elizabeth's voice trailed off, giving way to violent sobs that shook her entire body. Monster stared long and hard at Elizabeth, quite at a loss for words. He rose to his feet, halberd resting on one shoulder, and left without another word. He stopped to rest atop a distant boulder, and looked up at the cliff beyond which the village once stood. Somewhere, deep inside him, Monster felt a terrible, seething fire surge to life.
I'm still here,
he roared with a vengeance.
You thought you could destroy me. You thought you could bury me. But I'm still here. And where are all of you? Gone. Gone forever.
Monster's voice trailed off, fading into the wind as if his bitter words had never been spoken at all.
I'm still here,
he whispered.
I've won. At long last. I'm still here.
For a time he leered up at the cliff with a savage grin, but it did not last. His grin faded, his mouth grew weary, and he hung his head.
Nothing,
Monster growled.
It means nothing. None of you matter anymore.
Monster looked back over his shoulder. Not far away he could hear the sounds of weeping. He looked at the ground, brow furrowed, and clenched his teeth. Monster closed his eyes, sighed, and shook his head.
All over. They don't matter.
Something on the ground caught Monster's eye. A droplet of water? There wasn't a cloud in the sky. His perch was some distance from the stream. His vision felt strangely blurred. What was this? Again he glanced over his shoulder, but this time he held his gaze. Somewhere back there lay the only connection to the past. What should he do? Sever the final tie? Monster looked away and gave a harsh snort. At long last, his mind was made up. Without a further thought, he hopped down from his perch and ventured back to Elizabeth's side. Elizabeth hadn't moved since Monster left her. She was still curled up, now silent. Monster suspected for a moment she might have died in his absence. Perhaps a spider. No, a spider would have dragged Elizabeth back into its den. A centipede, then? No. As Monster looked closer, he could see Elizabeth's sides rising and falling as she breathed. He gave her another nudge with the end of his halberd.
Well, where will you go now?
Elizabeth shook her head.
Nowhere. There's nowhere to go.
Nonsense. There's always somewhere to go. Look at me.
Sniffling, Elizabeth wiped the tears from her eyes, and she did look at him.
I left the village long ago, Monster explained. I ended up here. I grew strong. I never ventured beyond, but I do know for a fact there is something beyond to venture to.
Elizabeth didn't respond.
Well, you're not going to just lie there, are you? Waste away to nothing? Food for spiders and crows?
Elizabeth nodded.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. There's no one left to live for.
Monster scoffed in disbelief, and planted the haft of his weapon into the ground with a resounding clash.
Nothing to...
He paced in a circle.
Well, surely you had friends. Ice that cared for you.
Indeed she did. Visions swam before Elizabeth's eyes of the faces she loved most, the children, their families, and Dawn. Tears welled up as she recalled them each, and she burst out sobbing all over again. Monster sighed in irritation.
I suppose they'd want you to give up, then. Flicker out like a dying candle in the wind.
There was no answer forthcoming, only more tears.
And here I thought you were strong, courageous,
Monster growled. He heaved his weapon over one shoulder and turned away.
But no, you're just as weak and cowardly as the rest of them. No heart, no spirit at all.
And just like that, Monster left her. He fully intended never to look back, but to go on living as he always had. Yet the sight of her lingered in Monster's mind, and he did look back many times. But at last he rounded a bend, and Elizabeth passed out of sight. But not out of mind. He looked back a final time, then ahead. Then he simply sat down, leaning against the wall of earth, hung his head, and closed his eyes. Monster wasn't going anywhere. If he had thought otherwise, he would have only been fooling himself. The sun rose higher. The morning dew evaporated as warming rays fell across the gorge, bringing some comfort and the refuge of sleep to Elizabeth. For a time she was back home, back to being the schoolmarm. The death and destruction was no more than a distant nightmare. Monster was not so fortunate. Like the spiders of the gorge, he shunned the sunlight, preferring instead to keep to the cool shadows, away from the sun's blistering heat. In those cold shadows he remained awake and restless, for the gorge was a place of many predators, and Monster needed to stay on his guard, especially in the shadows. The gorge pulsed with life lurking just beneath the surface, like a beating heart. Or perhaps a western shootout, with its many-legged gunslingers ever vigilant, should another combatant poke his head from behind his cover. Legs skittered under stones, eyes peered out from under cover. Somewhere, the dirt in a cliffside shifted and then crumbled. Something emerged, half blind into the sunlight. There was a rush of hairy, multi-jointed legs, and then the screaming began. Every creature in the gorge took notice, from flies to spiders to centipedes, and, of course, 2 mice. Monster raised his head, expecting to hear the death throes of Elizabeth Hartley in her final moments. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was jolted awake, first by flashbacks to the previous night, and then by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was under attack. These were not the hunting screams of the monster of the gorge. These screams were high, plaintive. They were cries for help by something quite small and quite vulnerable. They reminded Elizabeth of her students, her children, of Chrissy. Elizabeth sat up, rubbing the dust and tears from her eyes, taking in her surroundings for the first time since she tumbled over the cliff. She scrambled to her feet, first staggering, but quickly growing sure of her footing, as she rushed off after the sound. Many eyes followed her from the shelter of concealed burrows as Elizabeth ran. Hundreds of legs skittered along cliffsides and over rocks, shadowing the sounds of splashing as Elizabeth dashed through the stream. A very large, hairless mouse took notice as Elizabeth dashed past him, and rose to his feet to follow. Elizabeth paid no heed to the things trailing after her. Her mind, disturbed as it was, could only process one thing: the sound of a child screaming for his, or perhaps her, life. No fatigue could slow Elizabeth down. No doubt could make her hesitate. She hurtled onward without any thought. She occasionally stumbled as the uneven ground flew beneath her feet, but never faltered. The screams grew louder, closer, much closer than they should have been. The child was in motion and moving in Elizabeth's direction. As Elizabeth rounded the corner, a small, round, furry object crashed into her stomach. Small even for a young mouse. Hot on its heels was no mere trapdoor spider. As hairy as a wolf and as large as life, a tarantula dashed towards Elizabeth, fangs out and dripping with venom.
"Behind me! Quick!"
Elizabeth shouted. The little creature didn't have to be told twice. With a frightened yelp, he darted around Elizabeth's back and kept on going. Elizabeth, meanwhile, scooped up a fistful of dust and rock. As the tarantula bore down on her, she hurled it all at once into the spider's face and dashed aside. The tarantula staggered, momentarily blinded, fiercely wiping the dust from its eyes with a pair of tiny forelimbs. No sooner did Elizabeth turn to run than there came a cry of terror, and the little creature came flying back at her, bowling her onto her back. 2 centipedes, hissing fiercely, snaked around the bend. The tarantula, meanwhile, appeared to have cleared its eyes, and was now focused on both the 2 rodents and the 2 centipedes. It gave a shriek, as if to warn the centipedes to stay back. One halted in its tracks, but the other surged forward, fangs extended for the attack. Elizabeth scooped up the tiny rodent in her arms and dashed to the side, leaving the centipede and tarantula to clash. And clash they did. The tarantula, rising higher than the centipede, crashed down on top of it, fangs ready for the kill. But the centipede's armor was thick, far too thick for those fangs to penetrate. From underneath, the centipede struck at the tarantula's vulnerable stomach, chewing clear through the large spider's chitin skeleton, and boring into the vulnerable flesh beneath. Bits of crumbling dirt dropped down from overhead. Elizabeth spun around to see the second centipede crawling above and behind her. Yes, it had ventured away from the tarantula, and then climbed up and around to head off Elizabeth. Very slowly, very cautiously, Elizabeth backed away from the cliffside. Centipedes, you see, are quite blind, hunting instead by sound. As long as she made no noise, Elizabeth reasoned, it wouldn't be able to find her. That's when she stepped on the crack. The consistency of the ground changed, from the dry pebbles to the sticky texture of spider silk, lashing together a number of stones to camouflage a cork-like lid, the doorway to a trapdoor spider's lair. Even the slightest touch was enough to send vibrations roaring through every thread in the spider's underground web. It was not unlike stepping on a landmine of legs and venom. Elizabeth leapt back with a yelp, just as the spider burst forth, the trapdoor whipping open like a catapult and sending Elizabeth flying. The curious spider halted mid-stride, glancing about as if to ask, "What's going on?" The sound, meanwhile, caught the second centipede's attention. It dropped to the ground, narrow body flopping about as it struggled to gain its footing. The spider glanced to its right, where the first centipede was now busy eating the tarantula from the inside out. It then looked straight ahead to see the second centipede righting itself. The spider lifted its forelimbs, possibly to shrug, more likely as a threat, and then skittered backwards, quickly retreating into its den. The centipede, oblivious to the warning, zeroed in on the sound and charged forward with a savage hiss. Both the centipede and spider were just a bit too slow. The spider pulled the lid to its den closed just a bit too late, catching the centipede by the head as it lunged inside. Outside, the centipede's long body crashed and writhed about as the spider pulled ever harder on its door, pinning the centipede's head in place. All around, new cracks appeared in the ground as opportunistic eyes zeroed in on the trapped animal. Elizabeth dashed for the stream as all around her an arachnophobe's nightmare unfolded. Dozens of spiders emerged from their lairs, drawn by the sounds of the struggling centipede, a forest of shining black limbs creeping towards the helpless victim. Fang after fang gouged and skidded off the centipede's armored hide, dripping venom that sizzled against its chitin skin. As the spiders closed in, a number of fights broke out as outliers competed for the remaining spaces. One clever spider, however, took note of the mouse, standing alone with a little creature held tight in her arms. Elizabeth took notice of the spider as well. Every muscle in her body grew taut, ready to spring as the spider sidled away from the others, fangs twitching with expectation. Elizabeth inched towards the shore, towards dry ground, towards dust and rock. As if it had read her mind, the spider broke into a mad charge. Elizabeth whirled about and ran for all she was worth. The shore was her goal. Elizabeth saw other creatures crawling out from under rocks, many-legged things emerging from the dark, shady hiding places. But they were more interested in the chaos Elizabeth now left behind. A swarm of flies passed overhead, scavengers intent on the spider's feeding frenzy. That left just one enemy trailing after her. The spider had stuck to the shoreline, allowing it to move far more quickly than a mouse in the water. It did not take long for it to catch up. Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder, just long enough to see the spider draw up alongside her. It passed ahead to head her off before dashing into the water. Elizabeth bent low. It was a long shot, but this was better than nothing. Her fingers closed around a smooth, oval shape in the water. As the spider rushed at her, Elizabeth snapped upright, sending a wave of water splashing in the spider's face. Lacking eyelids, it could not shield its eyes from the water, and the world became a whirl of color. Its vision blurred, the spider could no longer see the mouse in front of it, allowing Elizabeth to leap out of its way. The spider's fangs plunged into the rancid water, striking nothing. But the spider could still hear the sound of splashing off to its left. It rushed about, forelimbs wiping the water from its eyes with an angry shriek, and resumed its pursuit. That was when Elizabeth whirled about, hurling the stone she had taken from the stream into the spider's face. The spider staggered, hissing in pain, as the stone struck it in the left center eye. Blinding agony swept through the spider's head. All thoughts of hunger were forgotten as a seething rage bubbled up from the deepest corners of the spider's rudimentary mind. The spider's legs coiled inwards towards its body as it prepared to spring, and then there was a crack, a squish, searing pain, and the spider neither felt nor did anything more. A powerful scream ripped through the gorge. This was not a plaintive cry for help, but a thunderous roar, a warning to everything that lived there. The monster had put his foot down. The feeding frenzy was over. Those spiders, not lucky enough for a piece of the trapped centipede, quickly retreated into their burrows. The first centipede, bloated and replete, scuttled for cover. In the brief lull, the second centipede, now quite dead from spider venom, was rapidly dragged down the nearest burrow, as if it were being slurped up by a hungry bird. The remaining spiders might have lingered and fought among themselves, if not for a second scream of warning. Elizabeth could have just about vomited. The considerable contents of her stomach at that moment threatened to launch themselves clear into orbit.
I knew I shouldn't have had that extra hunk of cheese,
she gagged, turning away from the carnage. Monster, having spent many long seasons in the gorge, was unfazed by the strands of slime trailing from his halberd as he wrenched it free of the dead spider's hide.
I'm impressed. It took me a season before I fought my first spider.
Glancing at the form held in Elizabeth's arms, he added,
Well, let's see what you found.
Elizabeth extended her arms, leaning the tiny rodent back as if cradling a baby. Smooth black bristles ran back from a tanned little snout, on the tip of which balanced a pair of little round spectacles. He greeted Elizabeth with a toothy grin. Monster grunted.
He's a shrew.
Yeah, I'm just a little lost baby shrew. Now come on and hold me close again. Shelter me from the storm, Mama.
He's probably old enough to be your father.
The shrew shot Monster a dirty look.
Y'all stay out of this, you big dummy!
Elizabeth, however, was mortified. Without hesitating, she set the shrew on the ground, apologizing profusely.
You were just so small. I thought...
Don't apologize none. Y'all just keep on holding me close.
Elizabeth took a step back. The shrew appeared to enjoy her touch just a little too much. The shrew's face fell, and he turned his attention to Monster.
Now see what y'all done, meathead. I had me a good thing going.
Monster ignored the shrew, his only acknowledgement of the little rodent's existence being to shove past him. Elizabeth had turned her back on Monster and the shrew, and buried her face in her hands. Monster watched her for a time, brow furrowed in thought.
I don't understand you,
he remarked at last.
A moment ago you were ready to die. Then you were running for your life. Now you're just giving up again?
Elizabeth barely managed to choke out an answer.
I'm such a fool.
Hey now, don't y'all be cutting yourself down.
The shrew interjected.
That's my job.
I just thought... maybe, just maybe, someone else was still alive.
The shrew looked down at himself, feeling himself once over.
I don't know how to tell y'all this, but I'm alive. Shoot, even the big dummy's alive. Ow!
Monster swatted the shrew over the back of the head.
She's referring to Edge of the Gorge, her village.
Y'all telling me a whole village got wiped out?
Elizabeth nodded.
Well, shoot, some people got all the luck.
Elizabeth's mouth dropped open as she stared at the shrew in disbelief.
Luck? How can you call that luck?
Monster shrugged.
He's a shrew. Selfish little creatures. If everything on Earth were to die overnight, he wouldn't bat an eye.
The shrew glared up at Monster.
Will y'all just get off my case already?
Monster responded with a warning growl.
Yeah, come at me, big dummy. I got enough venom to kill y'all 100 times over.
The shrew's voice died in his throat, however, as he found a gigantic blade pressed against it.
So do the spiders,
Monster snarled.
Have you seen what I can do to them?
With a sharp motion of the halberd, he lifted the shrew clear off the ground from under the chin and sent the tiny rodent sprawling with a low thud.
Stop!
Both Monster and the shrew turned aside, their attention drawn by Elizabeth's cries. Tears fell like rain from her eyes as she shouted.
Just stop! Both of you!
Her shoulders shook, her voice quivering, as she fought to speak.
Hasn't there been enough killing already?
After a short pause, the shrew answered.
No. Ow!
Monster gave the shrew a second swat over the head. Looking back at her, he bowed his head.
As you wish, Elizabeth Hartley. For your sake.
Thank you.
Elizabeth turned away, head hanging, and stared at the ground. The shrew muttered. He glanced to Monster. The giant mouse didn't so much as return the look. He crawled over to Elizabeth. She didn't acknowledge him either.
I'm Stew. Stew the Shrew. How do you do?
Finally, Elizabeth gave the shrew just the faintest glance out of the corner of her eye, the tiniest hint of a mournful smile tugging at the edge of her mouth.
Now, there's what I've been waiting to see.
Monster grunted faintly. Stew glanced between the two mice.
Well, are we all just gonna sit around watching shapes in the rocks?
That would be Elizabeth's call,
Monster answered. Elizabeth looked up, glancing back and forth between the expectant faces of Monster and Stew.
Me? What do I have to do with it?
If you wish it, I will escort you to the end of the gorge. Perhaps, in the lands beyond, you might find a new life.
And I don't need to be anywhere.
Stew chimed in.
I can sit here all day.
Which is reason enough to stop your weeping and move,
Monster added. Stew shot him a dirty look.
Are y'all gonna start that again?
Elizabeth shook her head.
I'm sorry. I really do appreciate what you're trying to do, both of you.
She cupped her forehead in her hands, running her fingers through her hair.
I just... I just don't know if I can go on. I've lost too much. I wish I could just lay down and die.
Monster grunted and heaved his halberd over his shoulder.
Then I have your answer. Rise and walk. Put one foot in front of the other. Keep walking until your feet bleed. Then rest and begin again the next day. Bury your heart as deep as it will go. Forget everything you have ever known. It is gone and will never return.
Elizabeth sighed and wiped her eyes. A new veil of tears welled up to replace the old.
I don't know if I can do that.
Neither did I.
Monster approached Elizabeth, circling in front of her, and extended his free hand.
Rise, Elizabeth Hartley.
She stared at his hand, hard and long. It was more than just an offer to help her to her feet. It was the choice between living and dying, the choice between an easy end and a long, hard continuation. A small, gruff voice cut her thoughts short.
Come on, Lisbeth, like he says. Rise!
Monster flinched at the sound of Stu's voice, but held his gaze firm. Elizabeth was all that mattered right now. Elizabeth wrung her hands anxiously. Her stomach twisted itself into knots as both options flitted about before her eyes, both equally terrifying.
You must choose one.
Monster spoke Elizabeth's innermost thoughts.
Either way, you cannot remain still.
At long last, Elizabeth made her choice. She took Monster's hand and felt the strength of his arm as he hauled her to her feet. Stu shouted for joy.
Y'all is just too sweet to just up and die.
How can you say that? You don't know anything about me.
Monster rolled his eyes.
He's a shrew,
He growled, as if that should explain everything.
That means I got high standards.
Monster shook his head and stalked away.
Oh,
Elizabeth blushed.
well, I'm flattered.
You'll be dead if you linger for too long.
Monster called over his shoulder.
The gorge is no place for a lady, no place for you.
Elizabeth started after him, half hopping, half running as she stumbled over the uneven ground.
Hey, wait for me.
Stu shouted after them.
I'm coming too.
Monster groaned aloud.
Don't you have a hole to crawl in?
Stu paused a moment, considering his next words very carefully. At long last, he thought better of it and shook his head.
Nope, don't got no holes.
Then dig one.
Elizabeth placed a hand on Monster's arm, shaking her head.
It's all right, really.
Not with me.
Jerry,
In a sudden rush of motion, Monster loomed close into Elizabeth's face, teeth bared.
Jerry is dead and buried. I am Monster.
Elizabeth recoiled from Monster's arm, and gulped in surprise, and, to a lesser extent, in fear.
Monster then. Just look at him.
Appearing to calm down a bit, Monster took a step back.
I'm trying not to.
He's all alone,
Elizabeth went on.
just like you were, just like I was.
And I'll give you 3 guesses why.
Elizabeth smirked.
Because he's a shrew?
He grates my nerves. I don't like the way he looks at you. He's a selfish, reckless, loathsome creature. And yes, he is a shrew.
Oh, and here I got to thinking y'all didn't like me.
Monster glared at Stu, and the hand holding his weapon twitched violently.
I'm leaving him.
Elizabeth set her hands on her hips, and fixed Monster with a look so sharp it could have cut through bread.
Well, I'm not.
With that, she took the shrew in her arms, and carrying him like a baby, strutted back to Monster's side.
Lead on.
Stu grinned up at Monster with a sly wink, and then gave him 2 thumbs up. Monster rolled his eyes with a resigned sigh.
As you wish, Elizabeth Hartley. Come then.
As Monster led off to the south, Elizabeth set Stu on his feet, and followed after.
Whoa, wait a minute.
The shrew protested.
Y'all ain't carrying me.
Elizabeth stopped, looked back, and shook her head.
You can walk.
Further ahead, Monster ground to a halt and softly chuckled.
Yeah, well, in that case, I ain't going.
Stu plopped on the ground and crossed his arms. Elizabeth shrugged.
Well, goodbye then.
Well, goodbye then.
Stu mouthed with a sneer at Elizabeth's back. He then slouched into an angry pout, but only for a moment. Somewhere far off there came a low rumble of falling rocks, and the sound of heavy, hairy limbs uncurling and contracting as something very large stirred into motion. Stu scurried to his feet with a frightened yelp.
Whoa, here comes the big one! Wait for me, Elizabeth! I'm on my way!
Elizabeth tried not to laugh as the little shrew charged past her, but she couldn't help smiling at him. Monster, however, made no such efforts, but let out a low snicker and continued in his course. Turning back to the path ahead, Monster braced himself against his halberd, and throwing his head back, loosed a thunderous roar. All at once the gorge ahead and behind burst into motion, as previously still creatures scuttled for cover. Monster glanced back at Elizabeth and Stu, and grinned at their terrified expressions.
Just warning the predators that I was coming. They shouldn't give us any trouble now.
What a trio they made. A mutant wild man, a young schoolmarm without a school, and the belligerent shrew, bickering and bouncing off one another every step of the way, bound together only by promises and ideals. Elizabeth seemed the only one to enjoy it. Try as she might to keep a straight face, every time Monster growled or groaned, every time Stu laughed, complained, or just opened his mouth, she couldn't help smiling. It was all a very welcome distraction. But distractions can only last for so long. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, Monster's pace slowed, and he began to search for a place to rest for the night. Many times, Monster howled into dark openings, and down holes and gaps in the ground and cliff sides. If he saw movement, he continued his search. The sun was casting its final rays over the horizon by the time Monster finally settled on a suitable location. It was a small circle of stones, tucked away under a shallow overhang dug into the cliffside, not unlike the nest Elizabeth had once seen Monster disappear into. That day, just a few hours prior, now felt like a lifetime ago. While Monster stood watch and Stu dropped into a deep, noisily snoring sleep, Elizabeth felt the relief of their somewhat testy camaraderie fade away into a terrifying, bleak abyss. No voices spoke, save for those in her mind. What predators ventured near were chased away or killed by Monster, with the exception of the one that stalked Elizabeth's thoughts. When she closed her eyes, all she could see was the eye, a terrible slit-shaped eye, glowing with the green of leaves and the red streaks of woody trunks, its pupil an empty slash down the middle. As Elizabeth hovered between dreams and waking, she saw the mice she had known and loved. Don, the children, the firekeeper, and even the cantankerous mayor, sucked into that crevice, that ravening abyss, like an all-consuming black hole. She heard them crying, wailing, screaming for help as they fell, down, 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 and vanished into nothingness. Then there came the howl, like nothing she had heard before. Something beyond even the voice of Monster. Elizabeth awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Her eyes were clouded over. She had been crying in her sleep. She threw off her cloak to let her fur dry out. The air was cold, or perhaps that was simply the blood in Elizabeth's veins, turned to ice. Either way, she shivered violently. The moon was full, turning the white stones of the gorge and the water of its stream to silver, and the earthen cliffsides to deep indigo in its pale light. Nearby, there came the sounds of Stu snoring. The world around her was at peace, but to the restless heart no place is peaceful. In that moment, Elizabeth was beyond restless. She was badly shaken with the aftermath of a panic that threatened to return with a vengeance at any moment. She sank back against the side of the nest, if one could call it that, and cupped her mouth in her hands. Elizabeth let the tears come. She kept her voice low for fear of disturbing Stew. Her breath shook in the night, and her shoulders shuddered with each rattling breath. She desperately wished Don were there. He had never failed to lift Elizabeth's spirits. But of course, Don was dead with all the others. That thought only served to summon more tears. Then Elizabeth heard the voices. Not voices in her head, ringing long-dead memories of words and phrases in her ears, but living, conversing voices. No, it was only one voice. Wasn't it? One voice, faintly mumbling, as if both sides of a conversation. Elizabeth's natural curiosity took over, distracting her from her dreams and from her pains. She wiped her eyes, and as silently as she could manage, she crept to the edge of the nest and peered out. There was no one there but Monster, sitting alone, his halberd lain across his lap. Still, Elizabeth had come to know his voice as of late, and what she heard mumbling in the dark was very clearly his voice. She only caught a few snatches of phrases, small things like,
"Fool, not the one,"
and
"Still, she."
Elizabeth crept closer. Was Monster perhaps talking about her?
"Soft and weak, good to be rid of her,"
Came a low, breathy rasp. There was a scrape as Monster ran a smooth stone along the edge of his halberd's blade. Elizabeth restrained a gasp. A bit of paranoia bled into her mind. Was Monster planning to kill her and Stew?
"Then you'll be alone, lonely, or at peace."
Scrape, scrape, scrape,
No peace, never any peace.
scrape, scrape, scrape. Monster held up his halberd, admiring the cutting edge as it shimmered in the moonlight.
Why sharpen it? It's the weight that cuts, you know. Vanity.
Monster set his weapon down beside him and was silent.
It's not home. There's no heart. I have no heart. I have no home. It would be good to be rid of it.
Elizabeth nearly jumped as she saw Monster's neck twist back and forth. But no, he wasn't turning around. Lumps of bone and vertebrae twisted and shifted under his skin with a series of loud, rapid-fire cracks. Then Monster began to sing. Or maybe it was a chant. Elizabeth couldn't make out any distinct words, only the low rasp of Monster's voice. The melody was slow and gentle. It may have been a lullaby. Yet as the song progressed, the tone became increasingly harsh, Monster's voice losing its music and turning to a low growl, while his hands curled ever tighter into fists. The song stopped.
Why sing? It's only a memory. Habit?
Monster?
The large mouse was silent for a time. He rolled his shoulders, joints crackling and muscles stretching.
Elizabeth.
Is everything all right?
Yes. And no.
He turned his head slightly, peering out the corner of his eye.
You should be sleeping. Tomorrow will be hard on you.
Elizabeth grunted with a faint, weary smile.
Not as hard as tonight.
You dreamed?
Yes.
As did I.
Tonight?
Many seasons ago, when I first came to the gorge.
What kind of dreams?
Loss. Pain. And you?
The same.
Monster nodded silently. He turned away, looking back to the stream.
And terror. Especially panic.
Of course. Your safe little box is gone. There is nothing to do but venture further and further out.
How far out did you go?
Never beyond further.
Monster punctuated his response with a low chuckle.
I suppose I was afraid. I knew the gorge. The gorge was home. The gorge was familiar. Safe, even. Everything beyond was outside.
Elizabeth gulped. She had to ask a dangerous question, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer.
Monster? Are you planning to kill us?
Monster laughed aloud. At the sound of it, something in the stream flopped away with a splash.
You've been listening in on a private conversation, haven't you?
A conversation with yourself?
An old habit, I'm afraid. I have no one else.
Elizabeth took a deep breath. It was now or never.
You said you'd be rid of her. That meant me, didn't it?
It did.
Elizabeth sighed and shook her head.
So, when will it happen?
I would guess tomorrow, as the sun descends. There is a tunnel, a steel tunnel. It leads into a gentle valley. You should be able to find your way without me from there.
So, you're not planning to kill us?
As much as the shrew may tempt me, no. But I will be rid of you.
Oh.
Elizabeth looked at the ground, somewhat crushed.
Well, thank you for everything.
Good night, Elizabeth Hartley.
Good night.
Elizabeth returned to the circle of stones, pulled her cloak over her shoulders, and curled up once more. Try as she might, however, she could not sleep. Her heart was a tempest, swirling about and whipping her along in its stormy winds. The moon's journey across the sky could not have been more sluggish, the morning's coming more welcome. Elizabeth's head was as heavy as her heart when, at last, Monster returned to the nest, with news that it was time to begin the day's journey. Mercifully, he took it slow that morning. It was as if Monster were in much the same state as Elizabeth, exhausted rather than rested by the night. Then there was Stew.
Just a few more minutes, Ma,
he croaked, as Elizabeth tried to rouse him. Upon waking, however, he was remarkably alert. The little shrew ran circles around his much larger companions as they trudged along. It was clear who the one person was that had slept. Once every half hour or so, Monster would roar a warning, sending mobile predators like the centipedes scurrying for cover, while ambush predators like the trapdoor spiders ducked inside their burrows and pulled them tightly closed. As long as Elizabeth and Stew stuck close to Monster, they were safe. Nothing in the gorge dared approach him. As the sun rose to its pinnacle, Monster picked up the pace. His howls grew more frequent as his movements quickened. As the day grew hot, Monster began leading Elizabeth closer to the stream, along the shoreline, where the cool splash of water dulled the heat. Stew, oddly enough, had grown quiet. Several times he removed his glasses and rubbed them against his furry chest. In the early afternoon, the shrew finally ground to a halt and sat down at the water's edge.
Monster, wait!
Elizabeth called out. Amazingly enough, Monster did stop and turned around to see what the matter was. He offered no argument as Elizabeth rushed back to check on Stew, nor did he speak up when she suggested they stop for a few minutes, so the shrew could rest. While Elizabeth stretched out and reclined in the shallows, Monster ventured into the deeper water. Occasionally he lunged for objects just under the surface, using the end of his halberd like a spear. Not far away, Stew emerged from the water and shook his fur out like a dog fresh out of a bath. There was a low poof, and his fur puffed out like a full-body afro.
Hey, look, Elizabeth, I'm a walking cotton ball.
She giggled softly. It felt strange in her throat and in her heart, but it was also pleasant beyond words, bringing a lightness and relief to her soul that had been unthinkable the other day. Stew laughed as he plopped down beside her.
Ah, now there's a nice sound. Y'all got a real sweet voice. Not like my ex-wife. She had a voice that'd raise the dead and then kill 'em in the same breath. And they was grateful to die again.
With a wink, he added,
That's why she's my ex-wife.
Is that how you ended up here, running from her?
Nah, funny story, that. I was trying to dig a mansion. A big, grand place that'd make all the other shrews jealous. I delved a bit too far, though, and...
Woke something in the dark?
Ha! I wish. Nah, the dirt stopped, but I kept going.
Monster, meanwhile, had returned to the shore, empty-handed, and sat down to dry off in the banks nearby. He watched and listened as Elizabeth and Stu talked. For a moment he cracked a smile. Then just as quickly it faded and his eyes grew sore and weary. Yet still he waited and allowed the two their time to relax. Monster looked away, glancing to the south, and silently calculated their distance from the end of the gorge. He glanced upwards, just far enough to gauge the sun's position. Yes, there was still time. Still time to savor the last moments of companionship. But as the sun slowly descended and the shadows grew long, Monster discovered, much to his surprise, a strange reluctance growing on his mind. It wasn't until the skittering began that he realized he had let his guard down. Eyes gazed out from their hiding places, and many legs crept out of dark holes. Monster's ears twitched. His eyes turned upwards, towards a red sky. Silently cursing himself for his loss of judgment, Monster rose to his feet and howled at the setting sun. There was a rush of legs, and the gorge grew silent, save for the surprised gasps of Elizabeth and Stu. Out of the quiet, there came a low, warning growl.
Get up, you two. We've wasted enough time.
What's wrong with him?
Stu muttered. Elizabeth, however, was more perceptive.
I thought that was a long rest.
She mused.
I wonder.
Wonder later,
Monster barked.
Now we must be on our way.
He turned and led off to the south, pausing only long enough to motion impatiently for Elizabeth and Stu to follow. Monster roared often now, and the roars took on a new tone as well. Now they sounded angry. Monster was also moving faster. Elizabeth struggled to keep up, and after a time gave up trying to get Stu into step. Much to the Shrew's relief, Elizabeth chose instead to carry him. Towering green hills, thickly wooded, rose to meet the mice as the gorge drew to its end. Shadows fell about them as the setting sun was screened away. Then at long last Elizabeth saw it, yawning like a great dark maw in the side of a ridge. Monster's tunnel. It didn't run very far. Elizabeth could see the sunlight shining in the other end. Stu groaned in disappointment when Elizabeth set him down, but he didn't complain. He had learned by now not to complain.
This is it,
Monster announced, turning around to face Elizabeth.
As promised, I have led you to the far end of the gorge.
Elizabeth peered down the narrow metal passageway, the tiny stream of water greasing its floor. She remembered Chrissy, that young sweetheart of a student, and for the first time Elizabeth found herself smiling at a memory.
What? Is there something amusing?
Elizabeth nodded.
I just remembered someone. I think I understand how she felt.
Elizabeth looked up at Monster, and her smile faded. He now wore a forbidding scowl that could have sapped the joy from anyone at the best of times. Elizabeth cleared her throat and straightened up, composing herself as best she could manage.
Again, thank you. Thank you so very much for everything you've done.
You can thank me by leaving quickly, and take the Shrew with you. His scent offends me.
Hey, y'all ain't no sweet Irish rose yourself.
Elizabeth laid a hand on the Shrew's shoulder, silencing him at a mere touch. Stu could feel his eyes crossing and his legs turning to jelly. The corners of his mouth curled into a broad, stupid grin, and he sighed with contentment.
Let's go, Stu.
Yeah, like y'all say. Stu's going.
Gone.
Elizabeth finished as she set foot in the tunnel. Stu struggled a bit to get over the ledge, but he was light enough for Elizabeth to help up. And just like that, the Shrew was on his way without a backward glance. Elizabeth, however, looked back several times. Once when she first set foot in that tunnel, second a few steps later, third halfway down, and last when she was reaching the other end. Each time she saw Monster standing at the entrance and watching. At long last, Elizabeth hopped out the other end and found herself between two easy slopes. The sun shone down on her, turning the world gold. As Elizabeth began climbing up the slope to her left, she looked back a final time. But all she could see now was a circle of metal and a tiny cascade of water flowing out.
Well, thank God we got rid of him,
Stu cackled.
So, where do we go from here?
Elizabeth held up a hand, gesturing for Stu to stop and be silent.
Nowhere. Not just yet.
The previous night, and all through that day, she had seen something in Monster. Not quite a promise, but most certainly a doubt. In the gorge, Monster still stood where he had been left. The scowl had left his face. He wasn't roaring anymore. Now he was just staring at that metal tunnel, his eyes slowly reddening, the water at his feet rippling with the occasional droplet. He hung his head and leaned ever more heavily on his halberd. Seconds ticked by, turning into minutes. Surely Elizabeth was long gone by now. Monster turned away from the tunnel, turning his gaze back upstream. The gorge spread out before him, but it no longer beckoned. What once had been full, terrifying, and ultimately thrilling, now appeared empty and hollow. The spiders were hiding, the centipedes likewise. Monster had long ago conquered this place. He had grown strong here. But now he felt weak and cold, and he wanted nothing more than to sit down beside a fire and warm his stiff, weary hands. And he had just sent away the last living mouse in Edge of the Gorge.
Well,
Stu piped up.
how long we gonna wait for that big dummy?
Elizabeth sighed, shaking her head.
I'm disappointed.
She spoke aloud.
And what? A bald mutant moron staying where he belongs?
Elizabeth looked up at Stu and rose to her feet.
I really thought... Oh, forget it. I guess he really is content in the gorge. I don't know what I was thinking.
Yet as she turned to clamber up the hillside, Elizabeth heard something far below. Heavy clattering, as of something rushing against the metal. She turned back. That scratching, scraping sound of rushing quickly grew louder. Then there was silence. As a white, hairless snout nosed its way around the edge of the tunnel, Elizabeth's face broke out in a look of pure joy.
Monster?
The snout quickly retreated back inside, as if it were ashamed to be seen. Softly, shakily, a most unfamiliar voice spoke from inside.
Do you think you can... That is, there is far worse out there than spiders and centipedes. Are you...
Elizabeth nodded emphatically.
I would be honored if you joined us.
Well, I wouldn't,
Stu shouted. Elizabeth smirked.
Hear that, Monster? It sounds like you annoy him. Is that a good enough reason to stick around?
The large mouse emerged from the tunnel with a splash and straightened up to look around this alien new world. Then he looked up at Elizabeth. She met him with the warmest smile she could manage. To say Monster smiled back would have been an overstatement. His face was as straight and firm as marble. Yet there was a change in his expression. The slightest of shifts in muscles. He appeared more relaxed, more at ease. Satisfied, even. Monster bowed his head.
My blade is at your service, Elizabeth Hartley.
And so he began an ascent that had been far too long in coming. Stu, of course, was not at all pleased with this turn of events.
Whoa! Oh, no, please, Elizabeth, say it ain't so!
Elizabeth paused beside Stu as she passed.
I'm not leaving him behind. I'm not leaving either of you.
But...
Elizabeth continued on, Monster quickly following in her place. Glancing aside to the shrew, he flashed a broad grin.
It is so, little shrew.
Oh, yeah. Laugh at the short guy. Real funny.
Stu paused, looking after the mice.
Hey, where y'all going?
Elizabeth looked back down at him and shrugged.
I have no idea. It's actually kind of exciting that way. Every day will be a new adventure.
Well, wait for me. Don't y'all be leaving Stu behind?
Monster gave Elizabeth a long, hopeful look. She just smiled back at him and shook her head.
Not until he's ready.
He may never be.
Elizabeth shrugged.
Then I guess we're stuck with him.
As the three new companions crested the hill, they came upon a flat, narrow plain. It was hard like rock and black as night, and had a crumbly, grainy texture. There were markings as well, straight and uniform, lines and dashes. I assume you know what it was? Work of the great apes? To Elizabeth and her new friends, however, it was something more. It was the end of an era. Elizabeth's ill-advised rescue was complete. Monster's self-imposed exile was at an end. Stu, that lovesick shrew, had left his old territory far behind. Here, now, was Elizabeth's road. A long, difficult one to walk, perhaps, but one she finally could walk. Her old life was gone, but she was no longer alone. By the grace of God and the devotion of his creatures, new strength had returned to her. She had, of course, no clue what lay ahead, for better or for worse. But then...
That's what makes it exciting. Every day will bring a new adventure.